In November of 1532, 168 Spanish soldiers walked into a city of 40,000 people, and by sunset, they had captured the most powerful emperor on earth. His name was Atahualpa. He ruled an empire larger than any in Europe, 12 million people, stretching 2,500 miles down the spine of the Andes, from modern Colombia to central Chile. His armies numbered in the hundreds of thousands. His treasury held more gold than any kingdom in the world. His roads ran longer than the Roman Empire's at its peak. He sat in a litter, carried by 80 nobles. He wore a crown of gold and emeralds. The cloth he used to wipe his face was burned after a single use, because no one was worthy of touching it twice. The Spanish commander who faced him was a 54-year-old illiterate pig farmer from a poor village in western Spain. His name was Francisco Pizarro. He could not read. He could not write his own name. He had 200 men, 62 horses, and 1 cannon. In less than 4 hours, his soldiers killed 7,000 Incas, captured the emperor, and broke an empire of 12 million people. How? How did the greatest civilization of the Americas, a civilization that built cities at 14,000 feet, an empire that ran on roads of stone, a kingdom that had never been defeated in battle, fall to less than 200 men in a matter of months? This is the story of the Inca Empire. How it rose, how it ruled half a continent, and how, in a single afternoon in the highland city of Cajamarca, it died. This is Dust of Dynasties. To understand how Peru fell, you have to understand what Peru was. 100 years before Pizarro arrived, the Incas were nothing. They were a small tribe of farmers living in a high mountain valley called Cusco. Their territory stretched maybe 40 miles in any direction. They had no written language, no wheels, no iron, no horses, no cattle, no money in the way Europeans understood it. They had something else. In the year 1438, a neighboring tribe called the Chancas invaded Cusco. The reigning Inca king fled in panic. His son, a young prince who had been passed over for the throne, refused to run. He raised every man, woman, and child who could carry a weapon. He fought the Chancas on the plains outside the city. According to Inca legend, the stones themselves rose up from the ground and fought beside him. He won. His name was Pachacuti, he who shakes the earth, and over the next 30 years, he and his son Tupac Inca built one of the most astonishing empires in human history. They did not conquer with numbers. They conquered with engineering. Pachacuti rebuilt Cusco in the shape of a puma. He raised stone palaces with walls so precisely cut that you cannot fit a knife blade between the blocks, walls that still stand today. After 6 centuries of earthquakes that have leveled every Spanish church built on top of them. He built terraces into the sides of mountains, turning vertical rock into farmland that fed millions. He commissioned a road network, the Chapac-An, that stretched 25,000 miles across deserts, jungles, and mountains, with rope bridges spanning canyons 1,000 feet deep. He created an empire that ran without money. There was no currency in the Inca world. There were no markets in the way Europe knew them. Instead, every adult owed a portion of their labor to the state, a system called the mita. In return, the state fed them, clothed them, housed them, and stored grain in massive warehouses so that no one in the empire ever starved. It was, in many ways, the most efficient government the ancient world ever produced. By the year 1500, the Inca Empire, they called it Tawantinsuyu, the 4 regions, controlled an area the size of modern Spain, France, Germany, and Italy combined. Its population may have reached 12 million. Its army could field 200,000 soldiers in the field at once. Its capital, Cusco, was wealthier than any city in Europe at the time. And then, in 1527, something happened that no Inca had ever seen. People began to die. 5 years before Pizarro reached the Andes, A sickness arrived from the north. It came down the royal roads, traveling faster than the messengers who carried the news. It killed children first, then the elderly, then everyone in between. Villages emptied, farms went unharvested, entire valleys fell silent. The disease was smallpox. The Incas had never seen it before. They had no immunity. They had no medicines that worked. They did not know it had come from a Spanish outpost in Panama, carried by a single sick man, passed from tribe to tribe through the trade networks of the continent, racing south faster than any human could travel. By the time it reached Cusco, it had already killed somewhere between 50 and 90% of the population in the regions it touched. And then, it killed the emperor. Huayna Capac, the 11th Sapa Inca, was at his palace in Quito when the fever took him. His designated heir, his eldest son, died a few days later in the same room. The empire was thrown into chaos. 2 of his other sons claimed the throne. The first was Huáscar, the legitimate heir according to Inca tradition. He ruled from Cusco, the ancient capital. He had the support of the nobles and the priests. The second was Atahualpa, born to a concubine, but raised in the northern province of Quito. He had the support of the army, the veterans who had spent years campaigning with his father in the north. For 5 years, brother fought brother. It was the bloodiest civil war the Inca Empire had ever seen. Tens of thousands died. Cities were burned. Provinces switched sides. The roads that had once unified an empire now carried armies marching to slaughter each other. In April of 1532, Atahualpa's generals finally captured Huáscar outside the gates of Cusco. They marched him into the city in chains. They executed his wives, his children, his ministers, his servants, every person who had supported his claim. The streets of the holy city ran with blood. Atahualpa was victorious. He was the new Sapa Inca, the emperor of half a continent. He had won the throne just in time to lose the empire. Because 5 months earlier, on the northern coast of Peru, 168 Spaniards had stepped off their ships. Francisco Pizarro had been chasing rumors of gold for nearly a decade. He was born around 1478 in the dusty town of Trujillo in western Spain, the illegitimate son of a minor nobleman, abandoned at birth, raised by his mother in poverty. He never went to school. He worked as a pig herder before sailing for the New World in 1502. By the time he was 40, he was a low-ranking captain in Panama, fighting in jungle skirmishes for a pittance. But he had heard the stories. Far to the south, beyond the equator, there was a kingdom where the lords drank from cups of solid gold, and the temples were covered in plates of beaten silver. In 1524 and 1526, he led 2 failed expeditions south. Men died of disease, men died of starvation, men deserted. On the second voyage, when his crew demanded to turn back, he drew a line in the sand with his sword and told them, those who wanted to return to Panama and remain poor could cross. Those who wanted to come south with him and become rich, stay. 13 men stayed. The rest sailed home. Those 13, known to history as the 13 of Fame, were the first Europeans to see the coast of the Inca Empire. They returned to Spain with samples of gold and silver, with llamas and emeralds and finely woven cloth. They convinced the King of Spain to fund a real expedition. In January of 1531, Pizarro sailed from Panama with 180 soldiers. By the time they had marched south through the deserts of the Peruvian coast, they were down to 168. 27 of them rode horses. In September of 1532, they began climbing into the Andes. They climbed for 2 months. They scaled passes at 15,000 feet, heights no European had ever reached. They crossed rope bridges that swayed over canyons so deep the bottoms could not be seen. They passed Inca fortresses, garrisoned by thousands of soldiers, fortresses that, with a single command, could have ended the expedition in an afternoon. The garrisons let them pass. Atahualpa had heard about the Spanish. His scouts had been watching them since they landed. He knew their numbers. He knew their weapons. He knew exactly where they were and where they were going. He let them come. He thought they were curiosities. He thought they were envoys. He thought, in any case, that 168 men could pose no possible threat to an empire of millions. He invited them to meet him in the highland town of Cajamarca. The Spanish entered Cajamarca on November 15, 1532. The town was almost empty. Atahualpa had sent the residents away. He was camped a few miles outside in a hot springs valley with his army of 40,000 men. The Spanish soldiers looked across the valley at the white tents of the Inca camp stretching for miles. They saw smoke rising from thousands of cook fires. They saw the gold ornaments of the nobles flashing in the afternoon sun. Many of them were terrified. Several wet themselves with fear. One soldier wrote later that he had never seen anything so frightening in his life. That night, Pizarro met with his captains in the central plaza of Cajamarca. They were trapped. They could not retreat. The passes behind them were closed. They could not fight in the open. They would be overwhelmed in minutes. They could not run. There was nowhere to run to. So they decided to do what no rational army would have ever attempted. They decided to capture the emperor himself. The plan was simple. They would hide their soldiers and cavalry inside the buildings ringing the central plaza of Cajamarca. They would invite Atahualpa to enter the plaza for a peaceful meeting. When he came, at a signal, they would charge from every side at once. It was suicide. If it failed, every Spaniard in Peru would die that afternoon. The next morning, November 16, 1532, Atahualpa arrived. He came in a golden litter carried by 80 nobles in blue and silver livery. He was accompanied by between 5,000 and 7,000 attendants, most of them unarmed, dressed for ceremony, carrying flowers and ornamental staffs. The Inca emperor saw no reason to bring warriors to meet a delegation of foreign envoys. He entered the plaza of Cajamarca. A Spanish priest named Vicente de Valverde walked out to meet him. He carried a Bible and a crucifix. Through an interpreter, he demanded that Atahualpa accept Christianity and submit to the King of Spain. He held out the Bible. Atahualpa took the book, turned it over in his hands, lifted it to his ear, and listened for it to speak. When it said nothing, he threw it on the ground. That was the signal. Pizarro raised his hand. From every side of the plaza, the Spanish charged. The cannon fired into the densely packed crowd. The arquebuses thundered. The cavalry burst from the buildings at full gallop, their horses screaming, their riders swinging steel swords. The Spanish infantry ran into the plaza with shields and pikes and butchered every man they could reach. The Incas had never seen horses. They had never seen guns. They had never heard cannon fire. They had never faced steel weapons or steel armor. They were unarmed. They were trapped in a stone plaza with no exits. It was not a battle. It was a massacre. In 4 hours, the Spanish killed somewhere between 2,000 and 7,000 Incas. They lost not a single man. Pizarro himself received a small cut on his hand, the only Spanish wound of the entire engagement, when he reached out to stop one of his own soldiers from killing Atahualpa. Because Atahualpa was the prize. They dragged him from his litter. They tore the gold ornaments from his body. They put him in chains. By sunset, the most powerful emperor in the Americas was a prisoner of 168 Spaniards in a town he had walked into of his own free will. The army of 40,000 Inca soldiers, camped just outside the town, did nothing. They had been trained to follow the Sapa Inca. The Sapa Inca was captured. No one had ever given them orders for what to do in such a situation, because such a situation had never existed before. Without their living god to command them, they froze. Then, they fled. The empire of 12 million people had been decapitated in a single afternoon. Atahualpa understood power. He understood that the Spanish wanted gold. And he understood that as long as he was alive, his empire would obey him. He made an offer. He pointed to a room in the prison where he was being held, a room 22 feet long and 17 feet wide. He told Pizarro that he would fill that room with gold once, and then with silver twice, in exchange for his freedom. Pizarro agreed. For 8 months, the gold flowed in. Llama trains carried it from every corner of the empire: temple plates, royal ornaments, ceremonial vessels, statues of the gods. Priests in distant cities watched as their sanctuaries were stripped to ransom an emperor they had never met. The Inca governors obeyed. The empire obeyed. Atahualpa was still the Sapa Inca, and his word was still law. By July of 1533, the room had been filled. 6 tons of gold, 12 tons of silver. Worth, in modern terms, somewhere around $400 million. The Spanish melted it all down into ingots. And then, they killed him. The official charge was treason. Atahualpa was accused of plotting against the Spanish and of having ordered the murder of his brother Huascar from prison. There was a hasty trial. The verdict was guilty. The sentence was death by burning. Atahualpa was terrified. The Inca religion taught that the body had to be preserved for the afterlife. If he was burned, his soul could not return. He accepted a final offer: convert to Christianity and die by strangulation instead of fire. On the evening of July 26, 1533, the last legitimate emperor of the Inca Empire was baptized as Francisco, taking the name of his captor, and then garroted in the central plaza of Cajamarca. He was somewhere around 30 years old. The Spanish marched on Cusco. Along the way, they fought a few skirmishes. They lost a handful of men. But the empire, leaderless and shattered by smallpox and civil war, could not coordinate a real defense. Some Inca nobles even helped the Spanish, survivors of Huascar's faction who saw the conquistadors as allies against Atahualpa's loyalists. Cusco fell on November 15, 1533, exactly 1 year after the massacre at Cajamarca. The Spanish entered the holy city. They looted the Temple of the Sun, where the walls had been lined with sheets of beaten gold. They melted down the sun disk that had hung at the center of the empire's religion.
They smashed the mummies of the dead emperors, mummies that had been worshipped as gods, given gifts, asked for advice on matters of state. In 2 years, the largest empire in the Americas had become a province of Spain. There would be resistance for another 40 years. A puppet emperor named Manco Inca led a massive revolt in 1536, nearly retook Cuzco, and held out in the jungle mountains of Vilcabamba until 1572, when the last legitimate Sapa Inca, a young man named Tupac Amaru, was captured and beheaded in the plaza of Cuzco.
But by then, Tawantinsuyu was gone. The roads still existed. The terraces still climbed the mountainsides. The stone walls of Cusco still stood. But the empire that had built them, the civilization of Pachacuti and Tupac Inca and Huayna Capac, was finished. How did it happen? How did 168 men topple an empire of 12 million? The answer is not what the Spanish chroniclers claim. It was not the courage of Pizarro. It was not the favor of the Christian God. It was not the superiority of European civilization. The answer is 3 things. First, disease. Smallpox killed more Incas than any Spanish weapon ever did. By the time Pizarro arrived, perhaps half the population of the empire was already dead. The Sapa Inca who would have led the resistance, Huayna Capac, was buried in a tomb in Cusco before the Spanish ever crossed the equator. Second, civil war. The Inca state was built around the absolute authority of the Sapa Inca. When two brothers fought for the throne, the entire apparatus of empire, the roads, the warehouses, the armies, the priesthood, was torn in half. Pizarro arrived at the precise moment when the empire was at its weakest in 100 years. Third, the system itself. The Inca army existed to obey the emperor. When the emperor was captured, the chain of command broke. There was no parliament. There was no senate. There was no general who could rally the empire in the Sapa Inca's absence, because no such role existed. Atahualpa walked into a plaza expecting envoys. He walked into a trap that had been laid by men who understood his world better than he understood theirs. In the 4 hours that followed, the largest empire in the Americas, built over a century of war and engineering and conquest, ceased to function. The stones of Cuzco still stand. The terraces of the Sacred Valley still feed the descendants of the people who built them. In the highlands of Peru, in the language of Quechua, in the faces of the men and women who still walk the old roads, the memory of Tawantinsuyu is not gone. But the empire itself, the 4 regions, the 12 million subjects, the messengers running the royal roads from Quito to Santiago, was destroyed in an afternoon by 168 men who could not read. That is the story of the conquest of the Andes, and that is the story of every empire that has ever forgotten that strength without flexibility is a kind of weakness. This is Dust of Dynasties.